Hey folks, we're finally dipping into the dark side, since I'll be tackling a gacha game.
You what?
That said, not just any, since I'm returning to Project Moon's dystopic universe in the recently released Limbus company. A title whose story started in Lobotomy Corporation, continued in Library of Ruina, with more besides, given it's encompassed several comics and web novels. All of which has culminated in Limbus. It's a lot, but I'll do my best to answer the question. Was I in good company? Or was this a Faustian deal I wasn't ready for? I'm your host, Darlian. Let's find out together. Deep in the Black Forest, Dante has found himself cornered by a wolf, a lion, and a panther. That said, while this is a scene straight out of Inferno, the reality of the situation is even stranger. After all, what drives a man to have their head replaced with a clock? Especially when that surgery proceeds to destroy their memories shortly thereafter, leaving them at the mercy of the aforementioned dangerous trio. Really, his death would be a foregone conclusion were it not for the arrival of the Limbus Company boss, and the Sinners. One part mercenary and one part prisoner, these individuals are highly skilled and extremely dangerous. What's more, they benefit from a unique perk, as Dante can somehow revive them from death through an as of yet unexplained phenomenon. Which is a good thing, given that for all their combat prowess, they are utterly murderous idiots. Seriously, it's a wonder they managed to get anything done given how thoroughly committed they are to screwing the pooch. Then again, perhaps it's due to their expendability, as Limbus Company is searching for the mysterious golden boughs, objects which have sprung up in the ruins of the old Lobotomy Corporation buildings, essentially death traps. Whatever the case, Dante finds himself press-ganged into service as the team's manager, where answers will hopefully come, ideally before his team gets him killed. Admittedly, while the game does a solid job of drawing players into this central plot, it's understandable if the narrative feels daunting all the same, if only due to the sheer breadth of material it references. For instance, while I already mentioned Lobotomy Corporation and Library of Ruina, there's also a trio of written entries in the series, with Leviathan, Distortion Detective, and Wonder Labs all providing very different slices of the world. Yes, Limbus Company does work as a story even without having engaged with these elements, but there are certain moments in the narrative, especially as you advance forward, that heavily benefit from an awareness of certain plot beats, such as the nature of distortions. While I imagine this will eventually be highlighted as we progress further into the game, the implications surrounding these are more likely to hit home with series veterans than newcomers. Then again, new players are apt to have plenty to chew on as it is, because despite its nature as a gacha game, Limbus Company is incredibly story-dense, much in the same vein as Lobotomy and Ruina. Specifically, as you advance through stages, there will be a small visual novel scene preceding or following a fair number of them, which help to flesh out the story for each of the game's chapters. That and the occasional non-combat stage, which is strictly focused on expanding the plot without any requisite murder. As far as the central narrative goes, it's a lot of fun, and the decision to have a tight cast means they can give a lot more focus on fleshing out the characters in a meaningful manner. And to see them gradually progress from complete disasters to something loosely resembling a functional team, it's actually a bit endearing. But wait, you might have noticed that I said central narrative, and that's because there is some interesting little odds and ends to explore. First off, Identities. Essentially, due to a certain device, the Senators are able to channel a parallel version of themselves and use it in combat. This particular quirk makes a great excuse for how you can wield vastly different variants of the central cast without muddying the waters of the narrative with an endlessly expanding group of side characters. That said, there is some story elements tied to each of these identities, provided you rank them up to their final tier. Doing so unlocks a vignette that provides a snapshot of the sinner's experiences in that parallel world. Some of these are fun little side stories of what the characters could be like. or provide some interesting accompaniments to the narrative itself if they're based around a given chapter. That said, there's a particularly interesting element to all of these. These segments aren't told in first person or third person. If you read enough of them, it'll begin to click that they all have a very distinct voice and it's not impersonal. A detail that adds very sinister overtones, though it once again falls into something more impactful to series veterans. So, suffice to say, I will die on the hill of these being important and relevant, despite a certain buddy of mine's protests. Beyond that, there are some smaller fun details to enjoy. First off, there's Dante's Journal, a small accompaniment cached away in the theater section of the game. This helpfully fleshes out a lot of the terms players will encounter, all done through Dante's notes, which are sort of funny sometimes, and less so others. The other element is the bestiary. If you beat up enemies enough, you'll slowly gain information on them. While you're only able to access it while you're fighting a given enemy, unfortunately, there's some interesting story notes you unlock in the Observation tab which help to contextualize them and give you a chance to see the sinners being absolute idiots when it comes to note-taking. Honestly, the lack of just being able to access the bestiary at any time is a little bit surprising, since the Theater tab lets you freely see any scene you've encountered, even the ones that are wedged in dungeons. Speaking of dungeons, it's time to tackle the actual act of playing Limbus Company, and like any other Project Moon game, there is a lot to go over. If I had to actually put my finger on this, I'd have to call it a weird combination of turn-based RPG with some odd battle quirks, and some moments where it is tactical combat, and others where it verges on auto-battler adjacent. Let's start with the basics though. Each battle in Limbus has you picking a handful of sinners and throwing them into the fray, and as you'd expect, each of the sinners function extremely distinctly, which in turn is only further accentuated by the various identities at their disposal. That said, what truly makes this notable is how combat plays out. Every turn, each sinner is given a choice between two skills from their kit to use. Admittedly, it's pulled from a pool, with the most common having the highest chance to appear, making it entirely possible to have a choice from two identical skills. What makes this interesting, however, is that selecting a skill doesn't guarantee it as a successful action because, well folks, clashing in battle is alive and well. Just like Ruina, where two characters' attacks would intercept with each other, a clash occurs, where the two attacks essentially roll off against each other in order to determine which one has the highest value and goes through. Only, instead of dice, this time around it's a coin flip system. See, each attack has a base power and a number of coins associated with them. When they land on heads, they add their power to the skill, adjusting its power to a substantial degree. While this may sound like a simple system that ultimately decides conflicts based solely on luck, there's a few elements that add nuance to it. For one thing, when someone loses a clash, it only destroys one of the coins associated with the skill, allowing the defender to potentially recover, albeit with a now weakened attack since each coin also represents a separate hit. That said, the other major element for clashes, and the most important, is that they aren't strict 50-50 odds. Each character has sanity points, which increase as you kill enemies or win clashes, increasing the rate of heads turning up to 95% at the 45 sanity cap. Admittedly, this system can and will turn against you, as clash losses, ally death, and status ailments can plunge your sanity into the negatives and force your flips to trend towards tails. That, and if you hit minus 45, it'll cause your character to panic and outright skip a turn. And that isn't even the whole of your combat considerations. For instance, you may notice that attacks are colored. This is related to their sin, essentially an element which, alongside attack types like blunt, pierce, and slash, determine just how effective an attack is. That said, an additional layer is added because if you activate multiple skills of the same color in a turn, it amplifies their damage with an even greater boost if you activate 3 or more in a row, which occasionally justified me starting up a clash I couldn't win in order to ramp up a different attack that hit a lot harder. And even that isn't the whole of your options, since Each character can also defend, either dodging, blocking, or counterattacking based on what's in the character's kit. Like Ruina, blocking entails just soaking hits and mitigating things, dodging potentially nullifies the entire attack string, and counters, well, counter. Albeit at the cost of eating damage like it's a cheeseburger. Still, they're all valid options, and the fact that they replace the bottom skill on your row means they can also be used to clear out skills that don't mesh with your strategy. Admittedly, it can still feel a bit limiting at first, and then you start up-tying. See, there's two ways you can advance characters in Limbus Company. Leveling, which boosts a character's accuracy, defense, and health, and up-tying, which essentially expands a character's kit, providing a wide range of benefits. Some of these benefits are basic, like increasing a character's speed or boosting the base power and coin values of a given attack, but it hardly ends there. Certain attacks might gain situational effects, like more hits under certain conditions, additional status ailments, or having existing ailments improved. That said, the most obvious addition would be access to a Sinner's third attack, which tends to be a very central component to their identity. There's subtler elements too, in the form of a character's passive at tier 2 and support skill at tier 3. The passives are just that, abilities which boost the character and overall complement their kit, providing you generate the sin necessary to activate it, either by carrying enough or using enough affiliated skills in a single turn. Support abilities, on the other hand, function in a similar manner, only they kick in when the affiliated character isn't in the active party, opening up a lot of different synergies and serving as a major motivator to collect and uptie characters even when you're not actively using them. Though, as a small silver lining to all of this talk about uptying, while you do need to farm a resource known as Thread to uptie the various egos you acquire, the same can't be said for the character's base forms, which uptie on their own as you progress forward. As to their default egos, which, yeah, it's time to talk shop about the final element of your character loadout. Egos are effectively a character's super attack, which has a very distinct advantage of incredibly high base power and dice rolls, allowing you to frequently win clashes you would otherwise lose. And not only do they hit fairly hard, a number of them have solid effects on them and will activate a passive ability for the character that uses them, which again can really synergize with a character's kit. They also provide resistance to certain sin elements, which helps to mitigate an existing weakness a character may have against the type of attack, being blunt, pierce, or slash. That or just make you an incredible tank if you resist both. Which all sounds great on paper, but there's some limitations. First off, they require a number of specific ego resources in order to be able to use them, and they spend them. Secondly, any ego that is not the character's base ego will deplete your character's sanity, with the higher tiers tanking it, with everything that entails. And then, thirdly, and worst of all, if you drop to the minimum sanity of -45, you undergo a process known as ego corrosion, where your character is consumed by the ego they are trying to wield, and proceed to use a mutated form of the ego attack, which will frequently target arbitrarily. To say that this can entirely shift the battlefield is an understatement. And then there's overclocking egos. Essentially, if you hold down on an ego attack, you can force it to initiate the corroded version, which sounds psychotic on paper given everything that entails, but that said, if you have double the resources needed to initiate the normal version of the ego attack, your corrosion is instead a stable variant, which is unable to obliterate your own people. Unless the ensuing loss of sanity causes you to corrode immediately after, in which case you will obliterate your own people on the next turn. So yeah, if this all sounds like a lot, it's because it is, because while you might think the game is easy due to its accessible intro, well, it lives up to being a Project Moon title. Okay, yes, the human battles will sucker you into complacency for quite some time, as a fair number can be contended with simply by clicking the win rate button and just focusing on winning clashes. But then you hit Chapter 3, And even the normal enemies are taking your lunch money, in part due to them scaling in level rapidly, but also due to the passives and abilities they carry. While these elements were important before, it's at this juncture that you really need to be mindful of what an enemy can do. Though, your first lesson on this front will likely be the Abnormality fights. Abnormalities represent one of the shifts in the game's genres, as it eschews the fixed targeting, almost auto-battle-y facet of human battles, and instead allows you to freely target which abnormalities you want to clash with. While the initial ones you encounter essentially serve as something to cut your teeth on, it won't be long until you wander straight into something that ought to feel very familiar to Lobotomy Corporation and Ruina veterans. Larger abnormalities that tend to serve as major bosses in Limbus Company, and with good reason. They can hit like a train and have a wide array of attacks that they'll put to good use in wreaking havoc on your team. That said, there's a number of distinct elements to their fights as well. For one thing, their sheer size leads to them often having multiple body parts you can target, with specific attacks that they're doing being tied to these parts. In this vein, it can be immensely important to allow certain of their attacks to go through, such as those you might resist, in order to quickly bottom out the health of a particularly problematic part, or failing that, to empty a stagger bar in order to stun it and make it vulnerable to a more decisive blow. And just to whittle its health in general, given that abnormalities share its health with all its various parts. Still, even knowing all of this, these fights aren't the sort that you can tackle recklessly. Abnormalities tend to have very interesting quirks to them, especially as you progress forward. And these frequently manifest in their passives, which can help to better understand their modus operandi and to shift the encounter in your favor, or to let you know what to avoid so they don't abruptly stomp the life out of you and your team. Honestly, there's such a fun element of the game that I'm happy that there's a daily feature that you can engage with a rotating cast of abnormalities to bully, tied to farming thread no less. I just really do hope that another rotation gets added to the mix, because I really would like to try my hand at bullying all the new abnormalities that were added with Chapter 4, as well as those from the Refraction Railroad that have not actually cropped up again since. But before we get to the Railroad, I ought to mention the last stage style, namely dungeons. Every chapter culminates in one of these, and they essentially represent a grueling gauntlet of combat encounters. I say grueling because you'll find yourself navigating a maze, and you don't heal between the fights in it. While the initial dungeons aren't too bad, each one does escalate substantially. Fuck you, Chapter 3. And it can honestly be extremely harrowing if you lose a character, because, well, you might wind up forced to use someone you haven't leveled or who simply doesn't mesh with your team composition. And you'll be deprived of a support ability as well. Thankfully, there are save points in these areas, a saving grace that is more a necessity than anything, given they aren't short. It took me hours to clear Chapter 3 and 4's dungeons as compared to the normally snappy nature of the basic stages. That said, the story associated with them and the unique challenges do make these journeys memorable. As to the dungeon events, which can help or hinder your party, sometimes based on your choices and sometimes based on a coin flip, and again, serve to complement the stories within these locations. Honestly, I like the dungeon system enough that I even go out of my way to do the daily mirror dungeon. Essentially, it's a simple, storyless variant with a more roguelite focus than anything. It also has the added bonus of providing free lunacy 3 times a week and eco shard boxes, which are major assets to players since this allows you to both make free pulls in the gacha every 2 weeks and to also forcibly pick characters that you're missing. It also adds a heap of season pass progress, which, well, is also a godsend given there's a lot of resources on there, including egos. That said, if there is a single piece of content in this game that I would have to call my favorite, it's the Refraction Railroad. This was the absolute hardest content in Limbus, and I was so glad I managed to join the game before the first railroad closed, given that it was a time-limited event. Still, there's another one on the way, so here's what you'll be in for. Essentially, the railway I cleared was a gauntlet, similar to a dungeon in the sense that your health doesn't recover between fights. Only, unlike a dungeon, there's nowhere to heal, and your only way of recovering health is with characters you're not actively using. And each fight is a fairly challenging endeavor that only escalates as you advance further into its guts, requiring you to bring your A game. Thankfully, you do save your progress after every encounter, but to say it's grueling is an understatement, especially if you were interested in pursuing the optional banners associated with it, given they required an exceptionally timely clear of the entire encounter, adding a whole new layer of strategy and tension to the ordeal. I honestly can't emphasize how much I'm looking forward to the next iteration for the challenge alone, though the sheer excess of rewards you get for progressing and clearing is sizable. Anyways, at this point we're long overdue to talk about something other than mechanics, so graphics, let's get into it. And frankly, I appreciate this game on so many levels. Even when strictly talking about the visual novel sequences, the art is a lot of fun to see. That said, what I was really staggered by was the characters during combat. After the cutesy presentation of Lobotomy Core and Ruina, it's just great to see enemies and allies alike wielding some awesome powers. Sure, there's a few that feel simple insofar as their execution, but far more often, you'll be treated to something that just feels satisfying to see. The character designs are also great overall, both for the in-combat visuals as well as the character portraits, and as a small bonus, you actually get 2 for each character with a basic variant and their fully uptied one, with 3-star characters getting lightly animated ones for the extra bit of visual oomph. And this overall excellence insofar as its presentation doesn't just end with the visuals. Once again, the audio is an absolute treat. The voice acting, though solely in Korean, is solid, providing some real emphasis to what's being said, and actually had me pause to listen in a few scenes. That said, the part that really hit home for me is, as ever, the music. There is not a single track in this game that I've yet to dislike, and there's been more than a few times where I've paused in the middle of a battle to just bop along to one of the tunes. Chapter 4's music especially just clicked for me during some of the encounters. Oh, and for the Millie fans in the audience, you're in for a treat all over again because they once again serve as an accompaniment to those significant story encounters where your teeth are about to get kicked in and you're promptly smeared into paste. So yeah, this was a lot of words. We're now at the finale, and if it isn't abundantly clear, I really like this game. As someone who has effectively consumed every other piece of Project Moon media related to this franchise, it's been a trip to once more immerse myself in its world, and to see how it's progressed since the last entry. And even as its own separate story, I found myself dying to find out where it's going to go. There's a lot of details to sink your teeth into here, and if the overall breadth of the narrative is any indicator, the rabbit hole is only going to get deeper, so if you're a fan of narrative gaming, this will definitely resonate. And likewise, I really enjoyed the gameplay, if you somehow missed that despite my lengthy and excessive spiel. And yet, as much as I gushed about the finer points of it, there is an elephant in the room I haven't yet addressed. Namely, the monetization, since this is a free-to-play gacha game. But here's the thing, I am ridiculously fucking cheap. The idea of throwing heaps of money, especially at a gacha game, in some sort of weird, fucked up form of gambling is abhorrent to me. By any and all accounts, you'd think I'd hate this game, except the content doesn't actually feel gated. It doesn't feel like it's locked behind unlocking these specific characters. And even if you never spend a dime on this game, there's no story content you're specifically locked out of, and while the game would be difficult if you somehow figured out how to use all the free lunacy you receive, whether from starting up, from clearing missions, weekly maintenance, or the mirror dungeon, the game is still clearable with just the basic IDs. Would it be hard? Yes, without a doubt, but it is possible. Even still, there's more than enough systems in place that you wouldn't need to do so. Like I said, there's a solid source of lunacy to provide you a free 10 pull every 2 weeks if you so desire. all but guaranteeing you a new 2-star character if you choose a new banner, allowing you to flesh out the group of people that you have at your disposal and to provide brand new passives to support your team. The daily Luxcavations provide ample experience and thread to distribute to your units and empower them at a casual rate. As for progressing the Season Pass, while the free side is nice, I imagine some people might be concerned about missing the rewards on the paid side. And yet, every ego or ID will at some point be purchasable with ego shards, a resource you can easily accrue from mirror dungeons and from boxes that are granted on the free side of the Season Pass. Quite frankly, I was a bit of a latecomer to the game compared to some of my friends, and I already have every ego that's currently been released and all but 2 of the IDs, with the ones that I have maxed at up to 3. I could in fact buy the last 2 IDs that I'm missing, but I'm just trying to wait and see if I get them anyways. We'll see. Admittedly, I did throw $10 at Project Moon for the Season Pass because it supports them and provides guaranteed rewards. It's a pretty low investment though, and wholly optional at the end of the day. So yeah, ultimately I highly recommend this game, and given it's to the point that I debated a fellow reviewer, have obsessively gushed along some of my friends and theory crafted things for several hours, and caught myself blurting it out to other people including Bats, I think I can safely call it a crit hit in my book. Like, at this juncture, I have gotten so deep into the rabbit hole that I have multiple saved party formations that I'm not even using. They're just there for the sake of theory crafting and just in case. So yeah, thanks for tuning in. If you have something to say, leave a comment. If you enjoy my efforts to create new indie reviews and interviews, hit subscribe and the bell for a link to my Discord, the Crit Hit Cauldron. Check the description. There's also a link to my Patreon if you want to see reviews early or to support the channel, and to my merch house for neat swag like Crit Hit coffee mugs. That said, I'm still not sure if this will be the final thing I talk about for this game, because there is a lot of content, and Project Moon's body of works is one I'm passionate about. Depending on what you folks say in the comment, maybe I'll actually tackle one of the later chapters and see how it actually compares, and whether or not I feel the game is getting better. Whatever the case, I'll catch you on the next episode of Crit Hit. Take care till then, folks.